It's Sunday morning in Birmingham, Alabama. The year is 1963. A young black minister named Fred Shuttlesworth stands at the pulpit of the Bethel Baptist Church, his voice rising above the gathered congregation. Outside, Ku Klux Klan members wait in the darkness. They've bombed this church before. They'll try again. But inside these walls, something revolutionary is happening. The church isn't just a place of worship. It's a fortress, a meeting ground, a weapon against injustice. Fast forward 60 years to that same city. Walk into any Sunday service at a historically white Southern Baptist church and count the men under 40. You'll find maybe one or two scattered among the elderly couples and families where only the wives and children showed up. The pews that once overflowed with 3 generations of Southern men now echo with absence. Something is broken, and it didn't break quietly. Welcome back to Professor Archive, where we dig into the stories that shaped our world and the ones still shaping it today. If you're enjoying these deep dives into history and culture, consider hitting that super thanks button. It genuinely helps us keep researching and bringing you these untold stories. The relationship between Southern men and the church wasn't just religious. It was political, social, and deeply woven into the fabric of what it meant to be a man in the American South. To understand why an entire generation has walked away, we need to go back to when that relationship was still intact. When the church wasn't just a building you visited on Sundays, it was the beating heart of Southern male identity. In 1776, roughly 75% of American colonists identified as Christian, with that number even higher in the South. The church was where you met your wife, where you conducted business deals with a handshake after service, where your reputation was made or destroyed. For Southern men specifically, church attendance wasn't a choice. It was an expectation as mandatory as learning to shoot or knowing how to treat a lady. But here's what most people don't know. The Southern Church's relationship with its men has always been complicated, a dance between control and rebellion, submission and dominance. The same ministers who preached humility on Sunday often owned the most land on Monday. The same deacons who sang hymns about loving thy neighbor voted to maintain Jim Crow laws. The Southern Church created a very specific type of masculinity. You were expected to be the spiritual leader of your household, which sounds noble until you realize it meant your wife and children's souls were your responsibility. You were expected to be humble before God but commanding in your community. You were expected to turn the other cheek unless someone disrespected your family, your land, or your honor. Then you were expected to defend it with violence if necessary. This contradiction was baked into Southern Christianity from the start. When Baptist and Methodist churches exploded across the South in the early 1800s during the Second Great Awakening, they brought with them a fire and brimstone theology that promised both salvation and order. Slaves were told to obey their masters, wives were told to submit to their husbands, and men were told that their authority came directly from God Himself. By 1850, Southern churches had become the primary defenders of slavery. Ministers wrote entire theological treatises explaining why the Bible supported the institution. They pointed to passages about servants obeying masters, about the curse of Ham, about God establishing hierarchies. The Southern Baptist Convention itself was founded in 1845 specifically because Baptist churches in the North had started saying that maybe, just maybe, owning human beings wasn't very Christian. So when the Civil War came, Southern men weren't just fighting for their economy or their state's rights. They were fighting a holy war. Confederate soldiers carried Bibles into battle. Ministers blessed their rifles. Church ladies sewed Confederate flags while singing hymns. God, they were absolutely certain, was on their side. Then they lost, and that loss created a theological crisis that would echo for generations. How do you maintain faith when God allowed your righteous cause to fail? The answer the Southern Church came up with was the lost cause mythology. This wasn't just historical revisionism, it was a religious doctrine. The Confederacy hadn't fought for slavery, they'd fought for honor, for tradition, for their homes. The war wasn't about hatred, it was about heritage, and the church sanctified this lie from every pulpit. Robert E. Lee became a Christ-like figure, noble in defeat. Stonewall Jackson was martyred for the cause. The antebellum South was reimagined as a Christian paradise, destroyed by Northern aggression. And Southern men were taught that their grandfathers had fought the good fight, even in losing. This mythology did something crucial. It allowed Southern white men to maintain their sense of masculine honor, even in defeat. You weren't losers, you were faithful remnants. You weren't on the wrong side of history. You were keepers of a sacred tradition that the modern world had abandoned. Where are you watching this from? And what time is it where you are? Drop it in the comments. I'm always curious about how these histories land differently depending on where you're experiencing them. Throughout the late 1800s and early 1900s, the Southern Church became increasingly militant about maintaining social order. When black churches emerged as centers of African American life and, eventually, civil rights organizing, white Southern churches responded with a theology of separation. Integration wasn't just socially inappropriate, it was theologically wrong. God had created the races separate, they argued, and man shouldn't blur those lines. The 1950s represented the peak of Southern church power over its men. Church attendance nationwide hit its highest point in American history, with over 70% of Americans reporting they attended services regularly. In the South, that number was even higher. The church had successfully weathered World War II, the Depression, and the social upheavals of the early 20th century. But cracks were forming. Young Southern men were coming back from World War II, having seen the world beyond their small towns. They'd fought alongside men from different backgrounds. They'd seen Europe. They'd been exposed to ideas that didn't fit neatly into what their ministers said on Sunday. Then came the Civil Rights Movement, and this is where everything truly began to fracture. Remember Fred Shuttlesworth, who we met at the beginning? He was one of thousands of black ministers who transformed their churches into command centers for social change. Martin Luther King Jr., Ralph Abernathy, C.T. Vivian, these men used the church as both shield and sword. They held mass meetings in sanctuaries. They trained protesters in church basements. They sang hymns as they marched into police batons and fire hoses. And white Southern churches? Most of them fought integration with the same theological certainty they'd once defended slavery. In 1963, the same year Shuttlesworth was organizing in Birmingham, the majority of white Southern churches remained completely segregated. When ministers dared to preach integration, they were often fired. When congregants suggested welcoming black worshipers, they were ostracized. The largest Southern Baptist congregation in Mississippi held a vote in 1963. Should they allow black people to attend services? The vote failed. Not by a small margin. Overwhelmingly. But here's where it gets interesting. Some young Southern white men, especially those who'd gone to college or served in the military, started questioning this. They watched news footage of ministers like King preaching about justice and love. Then they went to their own churches and heard ministers defending segregation with the same Bible. The cognitive dissonance was crushing. If both sides claimed God, how could both be right? Most chose loyalty to their community over their conscience. The social cost of breaking with the church was simply too high. You'd lose your business connections. Your family might disown you. Your children would be ostracized. So they stayed silent. They sat in those pews and sang the hymns and swallowed their doubts. But they didn't forget. And crucially, they didn't pass that unquestioning loyalty to their sons. The 1970s brought new challenges: the sexual revolution, the Vietnam War, Watergate. These cultural earthquakes shook American faith in institutions across the board. The Southern Church responded by doubling down on traditional values. This was the era of the moral majority, of Jerry Falwell and Pat Robertson, of the religious right emerging as a political powerhouse. And it worked for a while. Southern white men, especially older ones, flocked to churches that promised to fight against the moral decay of America. They found comfort in ministers who said that the old ways were still the right ways. That traditional masculinity wasn't toxic, it was biblical. That wives should submit, that homosexuality was sin, that America needed to return to God. The 1980s and 1990s saw Southern megachurches explode. These weren't your grandfather's small country churches. These were massive complexes with bookstores and coffee shops and parking lots the size of shopping malls. They had rock bands and laser light shows and ministers in designer jeans who told you that God wanted you to be successful, wealthy, powerful. This new style of church initially attracted some younger men. It felt modern, it felt relevant. You could wear jeans, you could drink coffee during the sermon. The music didn't sound like a funeral dirge. But underneath the contemporary packaging, the theology was often the same. Women were still subordinate. Homosexuality was still an abomination. And increasingly, Republican politics and Christian faith were becoming indistinguishable. To be a good Christian Southern man meant voting a certain way, believing a certain political ideology, consuming certain media. The thing is, while churches were building their empires, the world was changing faster than they could control. The internet arrived. Social media exploded. Suddenly, young Southern men had access to ideas, perspectives, and information that their ministers couldn't filter. They could read about slavery and see that, yes, actually the Bible was used to defend it. They could learn about the church's resistance to civil rights. They could see megachurch pastors living in multi-million-dollar mansions while preaching about Jesus, who famously owned nothing and hung out with prostitutes and lepers. The scandals didn't help. In 2002, the Catholic Church's sexual abuse crisis became impossible to ignore, with investigations revealing that over 10,000 children had been abused by priests in the United States alone. While this was primarily a Catholic problem, it shattered the broader assumption that church leaders were inherently moral. Then came the Protestant scandals. Ted Haggard, the evangelical megachurch pastor who preached against homosexuality while sleeping with a male prostitute. Eddie Long, the Georgia megachurch pastor, accused of coercing young men into sexual relationships. The list goes on, and on, and on. But the real breaking point for many young Southern men came during the 2016 election. 81% of white evangelical Christians voted for Donald Trump. Not despite his admitted affairs, his crude language about women, his casino empire, and his complete lack of religious conviction, they voted for him anyway because he promised to appoint conservative judges and fight the culture war. Young men who'd been taught their entire lives that character matters, that personal morality matters, that how you treat women matters, watch their pastors and their parents justify supporting a man who embodied none of the values they'd been raised to honor. The hypocrisy was impossible to miss. The church had spent decades saying that Bill Clinton was morally unfit for office because of his affair with Monica Lewinsky. Those same voices now argued that Trump's personal life was irrelevant compared to his policy positions. It was the lost cause mythology all over again. The ends justified the means. Winning the culture war mattered more than maintaining moral consistency. And young Southern men, who'd grown up being told that Christianity was about truth and integrity, realized they'd been sold a product, not a path to God. The statistics are stark. In 2007, 23% of American adults under 30 identified as religiously unaffiliated. By 2019, that number had jumped to 40%. In the South, the trend is similar, just slightly delayed. The Bible Belt is fraying. But it's not just that young Southern men aren't going to church. Many actively see the church as hostile to their values. They've watched churches fight against LGBTQ rights while their friends and siblings came out. They've watched churches protect abusers while silencing victims. They've watched churches preach about helping the poor while supporting policies that gut social services. A 2019 survey found that among millennials who left the church, 73% said the church was too focused on politics. 67% said churches were too judgmental, and crucially, 56% said the church was too focused on money. These aren't complaints about doctrine or theology. These are complaints about how the church operates as an institution. Young Southern men aren't rejecting God or spirituality. They're rejecting the church as a corrupt political organization that has abandoned its stated mission. The COVID-19 pandemic accelerated this exodus. When churches fought mask mandates and social distancing requirements, when pastors called the virus a hoax or a punishment from God, when congregations became super-spreader events that killed members, young men took note. Once you break the habit of Sunday attendance, once you realize you can have a perfectly meaningful spiritual life without sitting in those pews, it's hard to go back. Then came the Southern Baptist Convention's reckoning with sexual abuse. In 2022, an independent investigation revealed that SBC leaders had maintained a secret list of accused abusers for years while publicly denying such a list existed. They'd actively worked to protect credibly accused pastors. They'd silenced victims. They'd prioritized the institution's reputation over the safety of children. For many young Southern men, this was the final straw. The same institution that had lectured them about moral purity, that had told them sex before marriage was sin, that had made them feel guilty for natural sexual desires. That institution had been protecting child predators. The betrayal cut deep, and it was just the latest in a long series of betrayals stretching back generations. Here's what the church refuses to acknowledge. Young Southern men didn't abandon the church. The church abandoned its principles. It abandoned the radical message of Jesus, who hung out with society's rejects, who challenged religious authorities, who said the rich would have trouble entering heaven, who preached forgiveness and love over judgment and condemnation. Instead, the Southern church became exactly what Jesus preached against: a den of vipers more concerned with power and wealth than with justice and mercy. Today, many of those young Southern men who've left the church describe themselves as spiritual but not religious. They still believe in something larger than themselves. They still seek meaning and community. They just refuse to find it in an institution they see as fundamentally broken. Some have found new spiritual homes in non-denominational churches that focus on service rather than politics. Some have explored other faith traditions entirely. Some have embraced secular humanism or agnosticism, and some still call themselves Christians while avoiding organized religion altogether, reading the Bible on their own terms without a minister telling them what it means. The irony is that the church could have prevented this if it had chosen justice over tradition during the civil rights movement, if it had chosen integrity over politics during the culture wars, if it had chosen victims over institutions during the abuse scandals, if it had chosen the teachings of Jesus over the pursuit of power. But it didn't. At every crucial junction, the Southern Church chose institutional preservation over moral clarity, and young Southern men noticed. What profession are you in? I ask because I've found that people's professional experiences often shape how they see institutional failures like this. Drop it in the comments if you're comfortable sharing. Where does this leave the Southern Church? The numbers suggest it's in serious trouble. Membership is declining. Attendance is dropping. The median age of Southern Baptist congregants is creeping upward every year. Within a generation, many of these churches will simply close their doors for lack of members. Some church leaders recognize this and are trying to adapt. They're addressing the abuse scandals more openly. They're backing away from overt political endorsements. They're trying to recapture a message of grace over judgment. But for many young Southern men, it's too little, too late. The trust has been broken too many times. The hypocrisy has been too blatant. The harm has been too real. And here's the thing. They don't need the church anymore, not the way their grandfathers did. They can find community in other places. They can find meaning through other paths. They can build moral frameworks without ancient institutions telling them what to believe. The Southern Church's power came from being the only game in town, the only source of social connection, moral guidance, and community belonging. That monopoly is over. And without it, the church has to actually offer something of value beyond tradition and social pressure. For an institution that spent centuries relying on both, that's an existential crisis. This isn't just a Southern story, though the South provides the starkest example. Religious attendance is declining across America, across the Western world. Young men everywhere are walking away from traditional religious institutions. But in the South, where church and identity were so thoroughly intertwined, where being a man meant being a church-going Christian, the rupture feels more dramatic. It represents nothing less than the collapse of a social order that defined Southern life for 2 centuries. And what's rising in its place? That's still being written. Some young Southern men are building healthier communities based on shared interests rather than shared doctrines. Some are rediscovering spirituality in nature, in philosophy, in art. Some are finding meaning in social justice work, in environmental activism, in building more equitable systems. Others, it must be said, have filled the void left by church with toxic online communities that offer the same certainty and belonging that church once provided. Jordan Peterson, Joe Rogan, various manosphere influencers, these figures provide many young men with the rigid moral frameworks and male identity markers they once got from church, just without the religious trappings. The future is still uncertain. But one thing is clear: the Southern Church as it existed for generations is dying. Whether something better rises in its place depends on whether institutions can learn from their failures, whether they can choose principle over power, whether they can actually live the values they claim to represent. The story of why young Southern men see the church as the enemy isn't a simple story of secular modernity defeating traditional faith. It's a story of institutional betrayal, of hypocrisy exposed, of a generation deciding that integrity matters more than tradition. It's a story of men who were taught to value honesty, justice, and moral courage, applying those very values to the institution that taught them, and finding it wanting. The Sunday morning pews in Birmingham are emptier now, not because young men have lost faith, but because they've found it, just not where their grandfathers said to look. If this deep dive into history resonated with you, consider supporting the channel with a super thanks. It genuinely helps us continue researching and bringing you these complex, nuanced stories that don't fit into simple narratives. Until next time, this is Professor Archive, reminding you that understanding history isn't about judgment. It's about learning from what came before, so we can build something better moving forward. The past doesn't excuse the present, but it does explain it. And sometimes, explanation is the first step toward change.